The wind brushed gentle across the plains that morning, lifting the hem of Caroline Whitcomb's calico dress like fingers testing the shape of a dream. She stood on the porch of the ramshackle house her father left them when the fever took him, the wooden boards sighing under her weight. In her hand was a letter, thick with promise and sealed with a name that sounded heavy, Jedediah Boone a man she'd never met, yet who now waited for her reply. Her fingers toyed with the edge of the envelope, as if unsure whether to hold it tighter or throw it to the dust. Behind her, Eleanor moved quietly, always just behind, just older, just plainer, just quieter. Her hands were wrapped in flour from baking the morning bread, but her eyes lingered on her sister's back. She had watched Caroline reject suitor after suitor, not out of cruelty but out of hunger, for something grand, something worthy of the beauty she wore like an inheritance. This letter, however, had stirred something unusual. It came from a man of means, from a ranch said to stretch beyond the eye's reach, a man not yet old, but far from young, known for silence and sorrow. His letter had been penned in careful, blocky letters. He'd spoken of land and labor and of loneliness. Caroline snorted, reading it aloud with theatrical flair, her voice lilting with mockery. He says he don't drink nor gamble, that he's widowed twice, but can offer a woman security and comfort. She laughed. Comfort? From a man who can barely fit through his own doorframe, I'd wager. Lord, what would I look like next to him? Eleanor said nothing. Her silence was her language. She noted the way Caroline's eyes didn't quite meet hers as she spoke, and how her laughter thinned too fast. The truth hung between them unspoken, their choices were few. The war had taken the men. The soil offered little. And their beauty, Caroline's especially, was beginning to draw more whispers than suitors. A girl unmarried by 20 in their town of Dry Hollow was already becoming a question. A woman unmarried was an answer no one liked. At supper that night, the letter lay folded beside Caroline's plate. Her food remained untouched. Eleanor poured milk into tin cups and asked softly, "Will you write him back?" Caroline raised her chin. "I will," she said. "And I'll tell him I'm no one's charity. If he's looking to buy a bride, he'd best write to the saloon girls." But she didn't write that. What she wrote was worse. She called him crude, called him fat, called him pitiful in his desperation. She signed it with a flourish and set it by the door to be taken to town the next day. When Eleanor reached for it later, after her sister had gone to bed, her hands trembled. She thought of the man on the other end, opening those words alone. She thought of his quiet house, the silence that came after dinner for one. And she thought of her sister, so afraid of being plain that she mistook gentleness for weakness. In town, the letter made its rounds before it even reached Jedediah. The postmaster's wife caught wind of it, and by the end of the week, everyone from the barber to the baker had formed an opinion. She turned down a boon, Mrs. Millie Crane whispered with delight. Thinks she's too good for money, too good for land. The judgment came swift. Young men once enchanted by her gaze now crossed streets. At Sunday service, no one sat in their pew. Caroline smiled through it. She wore brighter ribbons, let her laughter ring louder. But the mirror told another story. Her cheekbones no longer seemed as sharp, her eyes less sure. The town had closed its arms. Her pride, once her crown, began to tighten like a noose. Eleanor watched, quiet and watchful. Her love for her sister was not blind, but it was deep. She saw Caroline's pain like a flicker behind curtains, always present, always hidden. So, one dawn, before the rooster crowed, she packed a small bag with 2 dresses and a shawl. She took the old mare and rode out toward the Boone estate with nothing but a name in her heart. She left a note on the pillow beside Caroline's sleeping head. Asterisk, you wanted to be seen. I want to be chosen. Where you saw a burden, I saw a man brave enough to ask for company. I go not as your shadow but as myself. Asterisk. The road to the Boone Ranch carved a path through Ochre Hills and Sunflower Field. It was a long ride, made longer by the weight of uncertainty. Eleanor rehearsed her words in her head, but when Jedediah opened the door, tall, wide, face carved like an old oak, she found she couldn't speak at all. He blinked at her, confused. "You're not the girl from the letter." She swallowed. "No. But I'm the one who read it right." He didn't smile. But he stepped aside. And so began a silence unlike any she had known. A silence of shared breath and clinking tools, of two people working in tandem, never asking, always offering. She cleaned. He fixed. She cooked. He chopped. They never spoke of Caroline, and Jedediah never asked. In his own way, he had already understood something. That love, when it came honestly, rarely arrived dressed in the clothes you expected. Back in Dry Hollow, Caroline awoke to a house more hollow than before. She read the note twice, her eyes burning with something unfamiliar. She looked at her reflection in the glass and, for once, did not adjust a thing. Her fingers touched the edge of the letter she had once laughed at, and she felt, in some small and painful way, the beginning of something she could not name. And far away, under the wide western sky, Eleanor began to carve out a life with the man her sister had mocked, a life stitched not from declarations, but gestures. A bench he built beside the garden. A shawl she left on his chair. Their hands brushing over supper. A story unfolding not with thunder, but with quiet grace. The fire hadn't yet sparked, but the air was beginning to change. The wind shifted that summer, slower and warmer, like the breath of something waking. Eleanor moved through the Boone estate as if it had always been hers, not by declaration, but by the soft claim of consistency. She swept the porch at dawn, where the light met the boards like a quiet promise, and baked bread that filled the empty kitchen with memory. Jedediah never asked her to do these things. He never asked much at all. But when he passed her in the hallway or handed her a cup of coffee before chores, there was a silence between them not born of awkwardness but of understanding, two souls speaking a language they hadn't known they knew. Jedediah Boone, for all his formidable frame and reputation, moved with surprising care. He lifted barrels without sound, mended fences with precision, and paused each evening beneath the cottonwood near the barn as if taking account of some invisible tally. He rarely spoke of the past. His two wives were buried beneath matching stones near the western edge of the property. Eleanor noticed he left fresh flowers there every Sunday. Never grand, just wildflowers picked from near the stream. She never followed him. Some silences needed to remain untouched. One afternoon, as the sun hung heavy in the sky, Jedediah caught his hand on a rusted nail in the stable. Blood seeped through his shirt, and Eleanor reached for his arm without thinking. She cleaned the wound with water and cloth, her fingers trembling. It wasn't the injury, it was the nearness, the moment that stretched between them as her hands moved across the skin of a man she had once only known by name. He watched her in silence, then, softly, "You're not what I expected." She met his gaze. "Neither are you." That night she sat beneath the stars longer than usual. The ranch hands spoke quietly in the bunkhouse, occasionally sneaking glances toward the main house. Word had spread without words. They had seen the way he passed her the reins, the way she walked beside him, not behind. No one questioned it. Even the land seemed to nod its approval. Meanwhile, in Dry Hollow, Caroline had grown smaller. Not in body, but in presence. The mirror reflected a face she no longer trusted. Each morning, she watched the mail with a mix of hope and dread. There were no more letters. No invitations. Only Mrs. Crane's whispering flock and the cruel absence of attention. It was worse than scorn. It was irrelevance. She hadn't heard from Eleanor in weeks. Pride kept her from riding out, but shame finally drove her to it. She arrived on a Wednesday, her gloves pristine and dress crisp. The Boone estate stood large and dignified, yet strangely warm. She stepped down from the buggy with hesitation, her gaze sweeping the property like a trespasser. Eleanor emerged from the garden, dirt on her hands and hair pulled back in a scarf. Jedediah stood near the paddock, rubbing down a chestnut mare. The reunion had no theatrics. Caroline offered a tentative smile. You look different. Eleanor wiped her hands, uncertain. I feel different. Jedediah approached, his expression unreadable. Caroline extended a gloved hand. He nodded politely but did not take it. The silence stretched long enough to make her shift in place. Inside they shared coffee. The old parlor had been dusted, the curtains replaced. Everything bore Eleanor's quiet touch. Caroline attempted lightness, spoke of town gossip, of who had married whom, of who had gone bankrupt. Jedediah listened but offered little. When she joked, suppose it all worked out. One sister's misfortune is another's happy accident. The air shifted. Jedediah turned toward Eleanor and said with simple finality, I don't see it as misfortune. Caroline's smile faltered. Her laugh didn't quite land. The visit was shorter than she intended. As she left, Eleanor walked her to the buggy. I didn't mean to hurt you, Caroline said, eyes downcast. I just didn't see what you saw. Eleanor touched her hand. Neither did I. Not until I was standing still long enough for him to look. Back inside, Jedediah was fixing the hinge on the pantry door. He didn't ask what was said. He didn't need to. That night, Eleanor placed an extra quilt on the bed and sat beside the fire, her knitting idle in her lap. Jedediah joined her, his presence filling the room without effort. After a long pause, he spoke. She didn't love me. Eleanor looked up. She didn't even know you. He nodded. But you do. Her eyes softened. I'm still learning. What began in silence grew roots through repetition. A week later, a storm rolled in from the west. The air thickened, clouds swelled like bruises, and lightning carved the sky. As the rain fell in sheets, a bolt struck the barn. The dry timber ignited fast. Flames leapt hungrily toward the loft where the hay was stored. Jedediah ran toward it without thought. Eleanor, against every instinct, followed. Smoke choked the air. Horses screamed in panic. Together, they flung open stalls, untied reins, and slapped the rumps of the frightened beasts into the night. A beam cracked overhead. Eleanor pushed Jedediah forward, but her skirt caught a live ember. The fabric curled into flame. Jedediah turned, eyes wild, and wrapped his coat around her, pressing the fire to the dirt with his bare hands. Later, after the flames died and the barn smoldered to silence, Eleanor sat in the grass, coughing smoke. Jedediah knelt beside her, the back of his hands blistered, but his eyes steady. He said nothing, only brushed the soot from her cheek with the backs of his fingers. She placed her hand over his and held it there. In the days that followed, the ranch hands helped rebuild. The community came with lumber and nails. The barn would rise again. But something else had already been built, quietly, without fanfare. One morning, Eleanor found a small box on her windowsill. Inside was a ring, not store-bought, but carved from the very wood of the barn they'd saved each other in. A rough circle, smooth inside. No inscription. No proposal. Just the offering of a man who spoke through actions. She didn't cry. She simply placed it on her finger and went downstairs. As the morning sun touched the ridge, she joined Jedediah on the porch. He handed her a cup of coffee, and together they watched the light move across the fields. Their love wasn't loud. It didn't bloom in declarations or dance in town squares. It lived in gestures, in silence, in scars, in shared breath. For those who'd spent their lives unseen, this kind of love was the rarest of all.